Thank you, Lindsay. Our next guest, if you're a theater goer in Haliburton County, needs very little introduction. We're down to the fun part now. A carpenter by day, Tim Nicholson has been impressing crowds at the Highland Summer Festival for several years now. He's bringing us today a logging story that is based partially on an interview that I did with a local man who worked the last big log drive through this chute in 1947. So what he tells you today, what he acts out today, is really how it happened. So all you little kids, pay attention. Ladies and gentlemen, I bring you a logger named Michael Connolly.
My name's Michael Connolly, and I worked the last log drive that came through this chute. Now, Carol and I talked before this, and she told me, suggested... Looks like we're going to have to use this as much as I hate it. Yeah. Carol and I talked before this, and she suggested some things that I might want to remember to say. And if you don't mind, I'll keep my notes with me because I don't want to get on the wrong side of a woman who single-handedly built a log chute. I signed on with C.W. Hodgson when I was 21, just back from the Second World War. Logging was tough work. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady. In the winters, I cut logs up in the bush. In the spring, I worked the log drive. And in the summer and in the fall, I worked at Hodgson's Mill down in Halls Lake. There was lots of logging going on up here. And the type of logging we were doing was way different from the stuff that was done back in the Big Pine days. Back in the Big Pine days, men were in the bush 6 months of the year cutting trees. Oh. See, what happened back then was people heard that there was free land available, and so they came. They'd heard that this land was good and easy. Well, it was good to look at, but it sure wasn't easy for farming. A man could barely make enough to eat, let alone sell. And so, to make ends meet and to buy those luxuries like tea and sugar, the men took a logging in the winter. As soon as the crops were in, as soon as the harvest was put away, the men would hire on with one of the local logging companies, and away they'd go off to the bush for 6 months at a time, leaving the wives and babies home alone on the farms. Now that was way before my time, but there were men in the camps that could tell us stories of those times back when loggers stood nose to nose with the farmers about timber rights and whose job it was to keep the roads clear. Men like Jack Medill and Sam Whitaker and Ed Mitchell, they could tell you stories that keep you spellbound. There was lots of lumbering going on up here. Moss and Boyd had a crude up here. The Gilmores, the Hayes, the Gull River Company. Everybody was after one thing, pine. Pine was king. And not these little sticks you see now. The trees they cut gave them logs that were 75, 80, even 100 feet long, and they were 2 foot diameter at the top. And these trees were clear, no knots. They'd fall those trees in the winter and they'd stack up and square them off by hand with an axe, and they'd stack them up. And in the spring, when the ice was free of the lakes, they'd take all those timbers and they'd run them down the lakes and rivers all the way to Montreal, where they loaded on ships and sent to England. That's why they squared those timbers so they'd fit easier in the holds of ships. Now, why England? Well, back in the early 1800s, England got all its timber needs from Russia. And then this fellow Napoleon came along and he stopped that with a blockade. You remember the War of 1812? Yeah. Well, it was before my time. You were a lot older than I thought you were. Well, anyway, England had to find a new supply of timber. And she just happened to have this colony right here. It was ripe for the picking. So the cutters moved in, and they moved all the way from Nova Scotia to the Ottawa, up into Algonquin, and right down into here. They cut everything in sight. Oh. It was in the Ottawa Valley, early in the days of that, about 1830 or so, that some fella invented the logging chute. And those logging chutes popped up all over everywhere. We had them here, we had them in Haliburton, Minden, Norland had one, up here at Crab Rapids, down on Cushog, Boshkung, and we have one right here. Excuse me. I have this cold that just will not go away. The problem was, back then they thought that these big trees would last forever. They called it an inexhaustible resource. And so they never replanted what they cut. They just went through and took it. And by 1870, those big trees were gone, but the settlers had started to come up for that free land. And so sawmills started to pop up to supply those farmers with wood for their houses and their barns. Well, they needed logs for that, so they went back in to get the logs that weren't big enough for the timbers. So the land that was gone over once was gone over again. Pretty soon there was nothing left. Life in the camps back then, in the Big Pine days, was way different than what I remember. There would be 50 men in each camp living in a 40 by 40 foot log shanty. 2 men slept to a bunk, each man had a blanket, and they used their coats for a pillow. And that's all that a coat was good for, because if a foreman ever caught you in the bush wearing your coat, he'd say, if you were cold, boy, you ain't working hard enough. Now in the middle of the shanty was a 6 foot by 6 foot raised hearth called the camboose. And that's where Cookie made your meals. For breakfast you'd have salt pork, baked beans, bread, and tea. Well, you could have tea if you paid $1 a month for it. And then you'd be out on the trails at dawn and cut till lunch, where you'd break for bread and tea. And then when they quit for the day, when it was too dark to see, they'd be back to the shanty for dinner, which was salt pork, baked beans, bread, and tea, if you paid your $1 a month for it. Most of the men came to camps carrying what they had to wear on their backs. That means they worked in the bush for 6 months wearing the same clothes. Can you imagine what it was like when 50 men came back soaked to the skin after cutting bush all day? Imagine what it was like. And there wasn't no maid to clean up neither. In 47, when I was working, we still lived in the bush, in camps, but it was a lot different. For one thing, the food was real good. We had a choice meal every day. I don't know how those cooks managed to make such great meals on just an old wood stove and a bit of a table. Old Stuart Dawson, he used to work down at Wingamog during the summer, cooking down there, and then in the winters he'd come and work in the bush camps with us. He could make the best food almost out of nothing. My favorite was his raisin pie. Now, Jack Medill was our camp boss. Now, Jack was a hell of a man. Jack, they said, could spear a log up on Crab Rapids and ride that log down to the mill on Halls Lake in time for dinner. During the winters, we'd cut and we'd skid and we'd cut and we'd skid and we'd stack those logs up on skidways on the shores of all the lakes and rivers. And then in the spring, we'd go down and we'd collect those big piles of logs and we'd boom them all the way down Hawk Lake to here. Now those big piles of logs were held in place with what we called a butt log, which was like a big wedge. And we'd just come along and pull that butt log out, and that whole big pile of logs would just roll into the lake. Now, I remember one time, this big pile of logs was stacked up behind a tree. Now, the only way to get that pile of logs into the water was to get rid of that tree. So, 3 fellas went over to take a look at it, and that was Jack Medill, Jack Stoughton, and Floyd Mitchell. They went over to take a look at this tree. And they decided that they couldn't cut it because they'd be right underneath that pile of logs, so the only way to get rid of that tree was with dynamite. So they lit the fuse, pushed off from shore, and off they went. Except somebody tied the boat to the bank. So here they were, 30 feet away from a tree ready to explode. So Jack reaches for his axe, which he had just left on shore. You could hear Jack cussing from across the lake, and then we heard the bang. And those lads were just covered in bark and chips, and they were soaked to the skin from when that pile of logs hit the water. But they were none the worse for the wear. But they had to put up with a little bit of ribbon for the rest of the drive and for a lot of years after that. When we drove those logs, we'd catch them first up on Crab Lake. We'd put them over the Crab Lake Dam and bring them down into Hawk Lake where we'd boom them up. Now, boom them up means just take all those loose logs and tie them into a big pile of logs that just floated. Then we'd take that boom and we'd take her all the way down Hawk down to here. Now, taking all those logs down only took a couple of days. Cutting and skidding them took all winter. Now, when we got to this dam, we'd open up the stop logs and let the water just take those logs right down the chute and right down the river. And when we finished for the day, we'd put the stop logs back in, but we'd leave a couple out just to keep that water flowing. All the way down the river, on both sides of the bank, there'd be stranded logs pushed up on the sides from the force of the water. Now, the first year I was working with a crew of 20 men. We were tailing the drive. That means we'd have to follow down after the logs went through the chute and get all those stranded logs back in the water. Now, we were new at this. Me and my cousin, we were working together, and we were working with Sam Whitaker. He was our boss. So we're looking at the river, and we're looking at all these logs stacked up on the shore, and we said to Sam, like, how the hell are we supposed to get those back in the water? And Sam never said a word. He just walked in the water up to his neck, and we looked at him. 2 weeks before, that water was ice. Cold? You don't know from cold. What could we do? We just followed him along like a couple of pups. I mean, there's a man who was 40 years old, and boy, that was old to us. He's just walking in the water like he's going on a Sunday school picnic walk. We pushed those logs back in the water with our PVs. That was a lot of work. That first drive through was mostly all hemlock. Big hemlock. It came down through that chute and it just beat the tar out of it. Now that hemlock we're sending that hemlock down to the mill on Halls Lake there to be milled into timbers. And those timbers were shipped to Toronto because in Toronto they were digging a subway and they needed timbers to shore up the excavations for that subway. The second year we were hauling down, we hauled down on a Red Pine Lake, we hauled down spruce and pine. That was the last drive. That was about all we took down that year. Now on that second drive, I was working with a fellow named Doug Hodgson. You might remember Doug. He became the superintendent of education up here. Now Doug had just come back from university, but boy, he really loved to work the drive. Now Ed Mitchell was working horses for us that year in the bush, and he fell and he broke his leg real bad. Now we splinted it up, did the best we could with it, and then we shipped him out by boat and portage, and eventually he got himself down to Lindsay where the doctor, he didn't even take the splints off him. Apparently we'd done a bang-up job getting him splinted up right here. Boy, those are the greatest times. If I had my life to live over again, I wouldn't change a thing. The stories we heard, and especially the drive. Oh, the drive. You know, we'd be sitting around the fire at night and old Ed would say, you know, it ain't nothing I never knowed, but, and he'd be off on one of his stories. And now I've told you. The lives and living of thousands of men are being kept alive with this chute. There's nothing left now but a few photos, some folklore, some songs, and lots of stories of men who lived and died by the rasp of the saw. This rock here, some of those big trees have seen it all. And there's lots more to hear if you just listen. Lots more stories. I'll bet you right now, if you listen real careful, you can hear Sam and Jack and Ed all sitting there telling stories about how this log chute came back to this river. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll go down to the river and reminisce a while.